A retired soldier lived quietly in the mountains with nothing but memories of war and his loyal German shepherd. One cold night, a gunshot shattered the silence. When he followed his dog into the darkness, he froze. There, lying in the snow, was a young police officer bleeding out, whispering for help. The soldier had sworn never to fight again, yet destiny had placed this dying man in his path. And beside them, shadows moved. The smugglers who wanted the officer dead were closing in. What happened next will make you cry and believe in loyalty, sacrifice, and miracles once more. The wind over Bitterroot Mountain that night carried the kind of silence that seemed older than the trees. It was the deep, frozen quiet of early winter in Montana, when the pine forest stood like black statues and the snow fell not in flurries but in slow, deliberate sheets. Inside a weather-worn cabin tucked beneath the timberline, a man sat hunched over a wooden desk, writing by the orange glow of a single oil lamp. Thomas Granger, 56, had the stillness of a man long removed from noise. Tall and wiry, with weather-cracked hands and a back slightly bent from years of hard living, he wore the scars of a soldier, not just on skin, but in the way he moved, the way his eyes held steady even in stillness. His hair was silver-flecked and close-cropped, a discipline left unshaken. A faint scar ran along his jawline, a white reminder of something sharp and long ago. Thomas lived alone, by choice. The world outside had grown too loud, too complicated. Here, in the solitude of the mountains, he planted vegetables in raised beds and wrote out old memories he couldn't speak aloud. War doesn't stop when the fighting does. Some battles linger in the bones. At his feet lay the only soul he trusted to stay. Ranger, a 10-year-old German shepherd, large and battle-worn, stirred as if stirred by something only he could sense. His sable coat was dappled with silver, especially along the neck and shoulders, and his left ear bent permanently from an old shrapnel wound. The scars across his right hind leg told a story of his own, stories of bomb sites, gunfire, and commands barked in the middle of chaos. But tonight, it wasn't memory that woke him. It was something in the air, a sound, a crack, gunfire, distant but clear. Ranger jolted to his feet, muscles taut, nose to the wind. Thomas paused mid-sentence. The graphite pencil in his hand hovered over the yellowed paper. His head turned slowly toward the window. Then came the second sound, not a gunshot, but Ranger's bark. Sharp, short, focused. Thomas's chair scraped back. He stood and pulled on his weathered coat, grabbed a flashlight from the nail beside the door, and holstered a sidearm he hadn't touched in months. The cold hit like a slap when he stepped outside. Snow coated the world in a ghostly hush, and the stars overhead blinked faintly through the cloud cover. Ranger was already halfway across the clearing, paws kicking up snow, heading toward the trees. "Show me," Thomas murmured. They moved together, dog and man through pines that rose like cathedral columns. The snow was fresh, and the world smelled of pine, smoke, and something darker. Blood. Thomas kept the flashlight low, watching Ranger's tracks and the way the dog's body shifted nose down, ears alert, tail stiff with purpose. It wasn't the first time they'd followed a scent like this, but it was the first time since the war. Minutes passed. The silence grew heavier. Then Ranger stopped. He froze on a slight ridge overlooking a clearing of wind-scoured snow. His body tensed, head low, one paw raised. Thomas reached his side and followed the beam of the flashlight to where Ranger was staring. At first, it looked like a fallen shadow beneath a tree. Then the light settled. There, half buried in snow, a man lay crumpled, face down, unmoving. Thomas's gut tightened. He slid down the ridge, snow crunching under his knees. The flashlight caught the glint of a police badge, the dark stain of blood blooming across navy blue fabric. He reached the man and gently turned him over. White, early 30s, short brown hair matted with snow, blood soaking his side. His face was pale, lips cracked blue, eyelashes rimmed with frost. A name tag read, Rhodes. Thomas leaned close, fingers at the neck. There was a pulse, faint, but real. The man was alive, barely, and judging by the blood pooled beneath him, not for long. "God help you," Thomas whispered. He turned to Ranger, who stood just feet away, eyes locked on the injured man, chest rising and falling with soft urgency. "Well done, boy," Thomas said quietly. "You found him." Ranger didn't move. He only stood guard, eyes sharp against the trees, as if already sensing that this was only the beginning. And it was. The wind sliced across Bitterroot like a cold blade, whispering through the trees and curling down the ridges as if to erase every trace of what had just happened. Snow spiraled in slow, relentless flurries, layering the forest floor in silence once more. But the silence couldn't hide the blood. Thomas Granger pressed his bare hands against the young man's side, ignoring the sting of cold biting into his knuckles. The blood was warm, wet, and dangerously fast soaking through Ethan Rhodes's navy blue uniform, melting the snow beneath him. Thomas had dealt with wounds like this before, far too many, but this was no battlefield, and yet the urgency felt the same. Ethan groaned, lips parting slightly, eyes fluttering as if caught in a fever dream. His breath came in short gasps, each one thinner than the last, and then a whisper barely audible escaped from his cracked lips. "Dad?" Thomas blinked, his jaw locked. That word hadn't been spoken to him in years, not since the war took everything that made life feel real. And now, lying in his arms was a stranger, young enough to be his son, bleeding into the snow and calling for a father he'd never know. The scar along Thomas's jawline throbbed as his teeth clenched tighter. He shifted his body, leaning more weight into the compress, his voice steady but low. "You're not dying out here, kid," he muttered. "Not on my watch." Ranger stood a few feet away, unmoving, a shadow in the snow. His chest rose slowly, his fur dusted with white, eyes sharp and locked on Thomas. The dog's ears twitched, not in fear, but in focus. He understood what was happening. He always did. Thomas cast a quick glance at him. "Bag," he said quietly, not expecting a response. But Ranger moved. Without hesitation, the German shepherd turned and took off through the trees, bounding down the slope with astonishing speed for his age. His bent ear flapped slightly with each stride, and the muscles along his back rippled under his sable and silver coat. Snow burst around his legs as he disappeared into the woods toward the cabin below. Thomas exhaled, steam curling from his lips. His hands were soaked now, the blood cooling quickly in the open air. He couldn't move Ethan, not yet, not until the bleeding was slowed, until the wound was packed. But every second that passed was a second closer to losing him. He scanned the tree line again, his other hand instinctively brushing the holstered sidearm at his hip. The forest was too quiet. He didn't like quiet. Beneath him, Ethan stirred again, a sharp, shallow inhale that shuddered through his chest. His eyes opened for a brief second gray, confused, full of pain, but they didn't focus. Thomas leaned closer, his voice firm. "You've got a name?" The young man's lips moved barely. "Ethan." The name hit like a small weight in Thomas's chest. Ethan. His son had once been named Ethan, too. That Ethan had died in the sand with shrapnel in his lungs and dust in his eyes. This Ethan was here, flesh and blood bleeding out under the stars of Montana. "I've got you," Thomas said gruffly, tightening the makeshift pressure wrap he'd formed from the officer's torn shirt. "You hang on." Minutes passed. The snow kept falling, gathering around them, soft and thick like ash. Thomas kept his hands pressed to the wound, switching once to warm his fingers briefly in the crook of his elbow, then pressing back down. His breath was rhythmic, not calm, but controlled. The wind hissed through the trees above. Then, a faint sound. Crunching snow. Thomas's head whipped toward it. A dark shape approached through the trees. Low, focused, familiar. Ranger. The German shepherd emerged into the clearing, panting lightly but determined, carrying something thick in his mouth. A strap dangled beneath his jowls, a faded olive-green canvas medical satchel, worn and patched from long years of service. The zipper was half busted, and the faded name tag stitched onto the side read Granger, T. It was the old field medic bag, the one Thomas hadn't opened in years. Ranger padded forward and dropped it neatly beside Thomas, then stepped back, tail low, watching. Thomas stared for a second, throat tight. The bag hadn't been touched since Kandahar, since that final mission when everything fell apart, and now it had found its way back into his hands, carried through snow, in the mouth of the only soul left who remembered. His fingers trembled as he reached for the zipper. The storm rolled in faster than Thomas expected. Thick flurries began to descend from the heavens like ash from some ancient, icy fire. The trees groaned under the growing weight of snow. The air turned sharp, almost metallic. Thomas looked toward the far ridge where the cabin would be waiting. No lights visible now, no path, only wind and white. He knew they wouldn't make it back, not carrying a half-conscious man through a storm that was quickly becoming a whiteout. He adjusted the weight in his arms. Ethan was shivering beneath the blanket Thomas had managed to wrap him in. His breaths were shallow but coming steady for now, a fragile rhythm that could collapse if he made the wrong move. Thomas scanned the slope and murmured, "There." Just below the tree line, mostly hidden behind a curtain of fallen limbs and snow-laden brush, was a formation he'd found months ago while foraging. A natural alcove in the rock, a shallow cave shaped by time and water, deep enough to shield them. It wasn't perfect, but it was all they had. He trudged toward it, boots crunching against the snow, knees aching with the weight of Ethan's body. Ranger, steps ahead, led the way with silent certainty. The German shepherd moved low and quick, scanning their surroundings, his silver-streaked fur half blended into the wintry landscape. His bent ear twitched at every gust of wind. The dog's awareness never dulled, not even now. Inside the cave, Thomas laid Ethan gently against the stone wall, layering pine boughs beneath him as insulation. The air was damp, stale, but out of the wind. He took off his coat and placed it over Ethan, then turned to the narrow entrance and began pulling snow-packed brush in front of the opening to block some of the draft. Ranger remained near the entrance, alert, facing out with eyes like molten amber glowing in the dimness. He didn't sit. He didn't rest. His breath fogged in the cold, but his posture stayed sharp-ready. Thomas gathered twigs, dry moss, and bark from a bundle in his backpack and built a small fire in the center of the cave. Sparks crackled, then grew into a slow, flickering flame. It cast long shadows along the walls and turned the space into something vaguely human, a pause in the wilderness. Ethan groaned. Thomas leaned in. "You're all right," he said, voice low. "You're with someone now." The officer's eyes fluttered open. Pale gray irises searched the dancing firelight before settling on Thomas. There was confusion there, but also something closer to trust. "Where am I?" Thomas poured warm water from his canteen into a tin cup and offered it to him in slow sips. "Somewhere safe, at least for tonight." Ethan winced as he tried to sit up. "I was chasing them." "Don't move," Thomas warned. "You'll reopen that wound." "The smugglers," Ethan rasped. "They're using the creek trail below the ridge, hidden path. Leads down through the pines, under the old quarry line." Thomas frowned. "How do you know?" "Watched them from the ridge last week. Didn't have backup. Thought I could tail them quietly." Thomas exhaled through his nose. "That went well." A bitter smile tugged at the corner of Ethan's mouth before he winced again. Sweat clung to his forehead despite the cold. Thomas dipped a cloth into snowmelt and pressed it to Ethan's head. "You're lucky we found you when we did." There was a pause. Then Ethan asked, "Who's we?" As if on cue, Ranger turned his head slightly, the fire catching the silver in his coat. Thomas glanced over his shoulder. "Him." Ethan blinked. "K9?" "He used to be," Thomas said softly. "Not anymore. But he remembers who he is." Ranger didn't move, didn't look away from the darkness outside. Ethan stared at the dog, then at Thomas. "You ex-military?" Thomas didn't answer right away. The fire snapped. "Retired," he said at last. "Like the dog, And like that medic bag that kept you breathing. Ethan nodded, his head sinking back against the pine boughs. I owe you. No, Thomas replied quietly. You owe the dog. A moment passed in silence, and the cave filled with nothing but the soft hiss of fire and wind curling outside the blocked entrance. Then a voice. Light. Distant. Unaware. Oh my God! Is that smoke? Thomas's head snapped up. He turned toward the cave mouth, his fingers brushing the sidearm at his hip. Ranger growled low. Outside the snow-covered curtain, footsteps crunched softly. Laughter. A second voice. Maybe someone's camping. Who'd be stupid enough to be out in this weather? Thomas moved to the opening and carefully shifted a small corner of the brush. Through the snow, he could just make out a man and woman, mid-30s, bundled in bright orange hiking coats, holding each other's gloved hands. Jack and Natalie Connor, local schoolteachers from Missoula, had wandered into the Upper Ridge Trail on their winter hike. Jack, a lanky man with horn-rimmed glasses and a permanently curious expression, led the way. Natalie, petite with a freckled face and strawberry blonde braid tucked into her beanie, looked slightly worried. Thomas narrowed his eyes. Civilians. He opened the entrance just enough to speak. Hikers? They both jumped. Natalie gasped, clutching Jack's arm. Jesus, sorry. We didn't know anyone was out here. Jack recovered faster. We saw the smoke. Thought maybe someone was in trouble. Thomas stepped into the light just enough for them to see his lined face, his still presence. We're fine, just weathering out the storm. Jack peered past him. You alone? No. Natalie blinked. Is someone hurt? Thomas offered a slow, firm shake of his head. Handled. The tone was final. Jack hesitated, sensing the edge in Thomas's voice, then nodded. All right. Stay safe. Thomas nodded back. Stay on the East Trail if you want to get back to the lower lot before dark. Got it, Jack said. Natalie offered a nervous smile. Good luck. They turned and disappeared into the snow, laughter fading with distance. Thomas pulled the brush back into place. He returned to the fire. Ethan hadn't stirred. Ranger hadn't moved. Outside, the wind rose again. Inside, the flame held. The fire had burned down to a quiet pulse, casting orange veins of light across the stone walls. The storm still whispered outside, but inside the cave, time seemed suspended, held in the hush between flickers of flame and breaths drawn slow with exhaustion. Thomas sat cross-legged near the fire, his back against the rock. His posture was still, but his fingers absent-mindedly rubbed the edge of a frayed cuff on his coat. Across from him, Ethan lay propped on one elbow now, pale but more present than he had been before. A blanket draped over him, his shoulders still trembling from the chill that gripped his body. Between them, Ranger had curled up, his old frame tense even in rest. The bent left ear twitched whenever a log cracked in the fire. His head rested on Ethan's arm, as though he'd placed himself there deliberately, half protector, half bridge. Thomas stared into the fire. My unit got ambushed in the eastern corridor of Ghazni, he said, his voice low and raw like gravel beneath boots. 6 men. Only 1 made it back alive. Ethan looked at him, eyes flickering with the kind of understanding that doesn't come from imagination, but from memory. Thomas didn't meet his gaze. It was supposed to be a clean recon, he continued, but something got leaked. They were waiting for us. He paused, then exhaled. They went down one by one. Richards took the first hit, then Evan. There was smoke, fire, gunshots so close they felt like thunder under the ribs. I froze. Might have died there too. But he came. Ethan tilted his head. The dog, Thomas said softly. Bruno, German Shepherd. Not much older than Ranger here. I'd never seen him before that mission. He was assigned to our translator at the last minute. No formal canine training, just instinct and loyalty. The flicker of firelight lit the edge of Thomas's cheekbone, revealing a scar that ran from the edge of his jaw to the base of his left ear. A faint line, often hidden beneath stubble and silence. Bruno dragged me out of a burning truck, pulled me by my flak vest through broken glass. I passed out halfway, woke up in a refugee hospital 6 days later. What happened to him? Ethan asked, voice barely above a whisper. Thomas's jaw worked. He didn't make it out. Silence returned, thick and solemn. Ranger stirred slightly, his ear twitching again, but his head remained on Ethan's arm. Ethan reached out with his other hand and let his fingers rest gently on the dog's back. "I lost someone too," Ethan said after a moment. "My father." Thomas glanced at him, not speaking. "He was a police officer," Ethan went on, staring into the fire like it was a window into another life. "Died on duty when I was 12, shot during a robbery he tried to stop on his day off." Thomas said nothing, letting the story settle like fresh snow. "I grew up wanting to be just like him," Ethan continued. "Everyone said he was a hero, and maybe he was, but—" He reached into his jacket pocket and slowly pulled out a worn, folded photograph. He handed it to Thomas. In the faded image, a tall man stood in a tan uniform, his arm around a small, sandy-haired boy. The man had a thick mustache, a strong jaw, and eyes that held something solemn even behind the smile. His badge gleamed under sunlight. Thomas studied it, then returned it gently. "You look like him," he said. "Everyone says that." "And does that scare you?" Thomas asked. Ethan gave a bitter chuckle. "Every damn day." Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the weight of something unspoken. "There's something cruel about justice," Thomas said. "It asks for sacrifices it can never repay. It takes, and you give because it feels like the only way to keep their memory alive." Ethan's eyes darkened. "Sometimes I think, if I die chasing these smugglers, maybe I'll finally make peace with him, like I earned it." Thomas shook his head. "Dying doesn't pay a debt. Living with honor does. That's the harder thing." For a while, neither spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Ranger let out a soft whimper and shifted his head, pressing closer to Ethan. His body curved protectively against the younger man as if to cradle the weight of pain too long carried alone. Thomas watched the gesture, then said, "He likes you." Ethan smiled faintly. "I like him too. He was someone else's once," Thomas said, almost reverently. "Belonged to a man who didn't make it back. Ranger waited by the gates of Fort Shelby for days. Wouldn't leave. When I found him, he wouldn't eat unless I stayed near." "Why'd you take him in?" Thomas looked at him, the fire catching the old soldier's eyes. "Because I know what it's like to be left behind." The words hung heavy. From outside the cave, a sudden gust of wind howled through the trees. Snow shifted from above the rocky overhang, cascading down in a soft huff against the ground. Ranger's ears perked, and he let out a low grumble, but he didn't rise, only watched the entrance. Thomas poked the fire with a charred stick, stoking the embers. "We'll rest tonight," he said. "At first light we'll make our way back." Ethan nodded, clutching the blanket closer. "I don't know if I can make it." "You've already made it this far," Thomas replied. "That's something." As the fire dimmed into soft red glows, Ranger pressed his nose against Ethan's wrist. A silent reassurance. A quiet vow. The three of them, one scarred by war, one by legacy, one by both rested under the weight of snow and memory, bound not by blood, but by shared loss, by old ghosts, and by a dog who refused to let either of them be alone. Outside the cave, the snow had slowed to a whisper, falling in lazy spirals onto the forest floor of bitterroot. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It pulsed with tension, as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Ranger, the 10-year-old German shepherd, stirred first. The dog had been lying near the mouth of the cave, head tucked beneath his paws, ears resting low. But suddenly, his body stiffened. His left ear, permanently bent from a past injury, twitched sharply. He rose with a low growl vibrating in his throat, sniffing the air with short, alert bursts. His tail stiffened. He looked back toward the men in the cave. Thomas Granger noticed instantly. The former soldier was stirring a small pot of snow over the embers, hoping to coax out a bit of warm water. His grizzled face, lined by years and worn by memory, lifted slowly. "You smell it, boy?" Ranger didn't bark. He didn't need to. His body said everything. The smell of gunpowder was faint but unmistakable, carried by the wind from a ridge a few hundred yards south. Thomas's heart dropped. He knew the scent too well. It wasn't from a hunter's rifle. He rose to his feet, every joint protesting with age. The tattered coat around his shoulders shifted with the motion, exposing a faded army patch near the cuff. His eyes were already scanning the treetops. Something was coming. Behind him, Ethan stirred. He had been resting against the cave wall, his face pale, but eyes growing clearer. The firelight cast soft gold across his cheeks. He sat upright with a slow, careful breath, still nursing the wound in his side, though it was bandaged now thanks to the old medical kit Ranger had retrieved. "What is it?" Ethan asked, voice hoarse. "Trouble?" Thomas said simply, then crossed the cave and pulled a heavy canvas bundle from the corner. Inside was a compact shotgun, wrapped in a woolen cloth, and a few small supplies: flare, compass, a pocket knife. Ethan tensed, trying to rise, but Thomas put a hand on his shoulder. "You're not charging into this, son. You just stay sharp." "No way, I'm just sitting here." Ethan looked around, wincing slightly as he reached for his belt. There was no gun. His eyes landed on the small radio still clipped to the inside of his jacket, its green light faint but blinking. "I'll call it in," he said. "If they're near enough, the sheriff's office might catch the signal." Thomas nodded once. "Just make it quiet." As Ethan pressed the transmitter and began whispering codes, Thomas turned to the cave entrance. His eyes studied the snow. A thin trail of soot curled into the trees to the south, a sign they'd left a fire burning. That was reckless, and that meant they were either overconfident or they didn't care who followed. Probably both. The smuggling ring Ethan had mentioned. This was their trail. Thomas's knuckles tightened around the stock of the shotgun. Memories pressed in on him. Jungle heat. Explosions. Cries for help that never got answered. But here, now, the cold bit his face and the only sound was the ranger's low growl. Thomas turned to the dog, locking eyes. "How far?" he murmured. Ranger stood absolutely still, then lowered his snout to the snow, sniffed once and looked westward with intensity. Thomas understood. Not close yet, but getting there. A branch snapped somewhere down the slope. Both men froze, but it was just a deer, bolting through the thickets with startled grace. Still, the message had landed. Time was running out. Thomas turned back to Ethan. "You ever build a snowblind?" Ethan nodded faintly, voice low. "I've built worse." "Then let's start." They moved with surprising efficiency. Thomas cut pine boughs with his knife while Ethan dragged snow into shallow walls outside the cave's mouth. They reinforced the cave's opening with broken branches and packed snow around the base, making it look abandoned. Within half an hour, the cave looked like nothing more than a crumbling shadow of rock. Ethan was winded, but his eyes were brighter. "They'll check caves," he said, panting, "but not this one, not right away." Thomas gave him a hard look, then softened. "Let's hope we're gone before they do." He turned to Ranger, who now sat tall near the edge of their makeshift cover, ears alert, gaze fixed beyond the trees, his body tensed like a taut wire. "Stay," Thomas said quietly, and the dog didn't move, just waited, just watched. The sky had darkened into deep slate blue, snowflakes were drifting again, but gently now. The air was charged. Thomas crouched beside Ethan, resting one hand on the snow. His breath steamed in front of him. "I remember a night in Kandahar," he said suddenly, voice low. "We were ambushed. I lost 3 men. One of them had a dog, a K9 named Rex. That mutt saved 5 lives that night, died before morning." Ethan didn't speak. He didn't need to. Thomas's voice turned quieter. "I buried him myself. Told myself I'd never go back, never fight again. But now." He looked at Ethan, then at Ranger, then at the rifle in his lap. "This time, I'm not alone." The silence before dawn was shattered by the crunch of boots in the snow. Ranger's ears perked first, his muscles tensing like a drawn bowstring. He let out a low, warning growl that rumbled through the narrow cave. Thomas, lying half awake with his back to the cold stone wall, sat upright instantly, grabbing the rifle beside him. Ethan stirred next, pale and groggy but alert, his eyes catching the flicker of movement at the mouth of the cave. The smugglers had come, not quietly, as snakes in the grass, but like wolves, bold and hungry. 4 of them, dressed in dark canvas and wool, faces masked with frostbitten scarves, rifles slung and blades gleaming under the pale light of early morning. They had followed the trail blood from Ethan's wound, ashes from the fire, disturbed snow. But what they hadn't expected was resistance. Thomas moved swiftly, motioning Ethan to the far corner of the cave. "Keep low. Watch your flank." His voice was gravel, his breath misting in the cold air. Despite the tremble in his joints, the old soldier within him awakened. Ranger darted forward, positioning himself like a living shield between the intruders and the 2 men. His eyes glinted with purpose. As one of the smugglers took a step inside, Ranger barked, deep and sharp, echoing off stone. It was the first signal the battle had begun. Thomas fired a warning shot at the ground near the closest man's feet. "Back off!" he shouted, hoping reason still lived somewhere in their bloodied intent. But desperation had long eaten away their judgment. A smuggler with a jagged scar over his left eye rushed forward, blade raised. Ethan, despite the pain in his side, grabbed the old sidearm Thomas had given him and fired once not to kill, but to disarm. The bullet hit the man's shoulder, knocking him off balance. He crashed into the snow, screaming, his knife flying from his grasp. Another figure emerged behind him, this one familiar. Ethan froze. The man's gait was unmistakable. He had limped that same way in high school after a football injury. Kenny Halbrook. They had sat in chemistry together, passed notes, talked about girls. Now Kenny's eyes were wild, bloodshot and shadowed with guilt. He raised his weapon. "Kenny?" Ethan's voice cracked like dry timber. The man hesitated, blinking as if woken from a bad dream. It was enough. Ethan didn't shoot. Instead, he lunged forward and tackled him to the snow, knocking the rifle free. The 2 rolled, fists flying, until Ethan gained the upper hand and twisted Kenny's arm behind his back, pinning him down. At the same moment, another smuggler tried to rush Thomas from the side. The old veteran sidestepped, hitting him squarely in the ribs with the butt of his rifle. The man doubled over, wind knocked out of him, then crumpled to the ground. The last of them, a taller figure with a black beanie and cold fury in his eyes, crept into the cave with a hunting knife. He moved fast, targeting Ethan's exposed back, but before Thomas could raise his weapon, a blur of sable and silver lunged through the shadows. Ranger. He collided with the man mid-stride, sending them both tumbling into the snow. The knife clattered away. Ranger didn't go for the throat. He bit down on the man's arm, hard enough to make him drop the second blade hidden in his coat. Then, growling, he pinned the attacker with his weight, standing guard with hackles raised until Thomas arrived. Thomas kicked the weapons aside and used a length of rope from his pack to tie the man's wrists behind his back. The smuggler cursed and spit, but offered no further resistance. The fight was over. Not a life taken, but several changed. Ethan sat in the snow, panting, clutching his side. Blood seeped through his bandage again, but his eyes were bright. He looked around at the subdued attackers, bound and groaning. Kenny was lying face down beside him, muttering apologies through chattering teeth. Thomas placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You held your ground. You didn't have to, but you did." Ethan didn't speak at first. Then he looked at Ranger, who was pacing now, alert but unharmed. "I couldn't have done it without him." Outside, the wind howled again through the trees, but this time it was different, like a sigh, not a scream. The forest seemed to exhale. Thomas turned his face to the wind, eyes distant. He remembered a night not unlike this one, long ago in a jungle half a world away, where the moon had been hidden and survival had depended on trust in a dog who had never come home. But this time the dog did. And he wasn't alone. Thomas looked at Ethan beside him, bruised but not broken, and felt something shift deep within. The ghosts didn't vanish, but they finally had company. He activated the emergency beacon from his old radio, praying the signal would reach far enough. "Let's get these bastards into custody before the storm seals us in." In the stillness that followed, Ranger walked over and rested his head gently against Ethan's knee, tail wagging slowly. Thomas couldn't help but smile. The soldier, the lost son, and the old dog, they had faced the storm and lived to see the calm. The storm had begun to quiet, but the echoes of the gunfire still lingered in the air like ghosts that refused to leave. Snow drifted over the battlefield, covering boot prints, blood trails, and empty casings with a deceptive veil of peace. The forest, once silent, now seemed to hold its breath. Ethan lay collapsed against the jagged wall of the cave, his breaths shallow but steady. The adrenaline had drained from his body, leaving only raw exhaustion in its wake. His side ached from the impact of a wild blow, and dried blood crusted the edge of his temple, but he was alive. That fact alone felt miraculous. Thomas stood a few paces away, his rifle held low, eyes scanning the tree line even as the last of the danger passed. His coat flapped slightly in the wind, revealing the edge of an old military patch sewn onto the inner lining, a relic of a time he rarely spoke about. And Ranger, the old German shepherd, stood at the entrance of the cave like a sentinel carved from storm and shadow. His sable coat was matted with mud and flakes of snow, one ear bent, the other alert. His brown eyes never left the figures groaning on the ground outside, the smugglers, now disarmed and restrained, lying face down in the snow. The sound of sirens crept into the forest like a distant memory returning. Faint at first, then louder, more defined. Thomas turned his head slowly toward the sound. Red and blue lights began to flicker faintly through the mist of melting snow. One of the State Patrol SUVs barreled up the narrow trail, tires slipping slightly in the slush, headlights sweeping across broken branches and bodies sprawled in the clearing. Another vehicle followed, then a third. Uniformed officers spilled out, weapons drawn but quickly lowered as they took in the scene. 3 smugglers restrained, one semi-conscious, a rifle kicked aside, and 2 men, one older, one barely upright, standing at the heart of it all. Lieutenant Marla Whitaker, a tall woman in her 40s with sharp cheekbones and braided black hair under her patrol cap, stepped forward. Her dark brown eyes flicked from the restrained men to Thomas, then to Ethan. "What in God's name happened here?" she asked. Thomas gave a single nod. "We held them off. Barely. They were armed. Came in fast." Marla looked at Ranger, who had not moved an inch. She blinked. "And him?" Thomas's mouth twitched into the faintest smile. "He saved our lives." As the officers moved in to cuff the smugglers and administer first aid, Ethan's legs buckled. The world tilted. He dropped to his knees, the cave floor spinning. Thomas caught him just in time, wrapping one arm under Ethan's shoulder. "Easy, son. You're all right." Ethan blinked up at him, dazed and barely conscious. "Dad," he whispered. It wasn't a word meant for thinking. It wasn't even a word Ethan realized he had said. It came from someplace deeper, a place beyond language, where memories of loss, hope, and longing twisted together. Thomas froze. For a long moment, neither man moved. The sounds of officers shouting commands, radios crackling, and the crunch of boots on snow faded beneath the weight of that single word. Then Thomas exhaled, slow and shaken, and looked down at Ethan. His weathered face softened. The lines around his eyes no longer just held war, but something else, something gentler. He gave Ethan's shoulder a squeeze. "I got you," he said. Behind them, Ranger finally moved. The dog stepped close to Ethan's side and laid down, his head resting gently across Ethan's lap. He did not bark, did not whimper. He simply stayed, warm and present. As dawn began to break through the thick pine canopy, the scene took on a surreal stillness. Officers led the prisoners to waiting vehicles. One of them, the man with the scarred eyebrow, tried to lift his head and speak, but a sergeant shoved him forward. "Save it for the judge," the officer muttered. Marla approached Thomas again. "There'll be questions, reports to file, Backup had been dispatched hours ago, but the storm slowed us. We didn't expect to find a war zone. Thomas nodded slowly. We didn't expect to win. She gave a tired smile, then crouched beside Ethan. You okay, soldier? Ethan opened his eyes with effort. I will be. They helped lift him into one of the warm vehicles. A medic checked his vitals, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and began tending to the bruises and scrapes. Ranger tried to jump into the SUV with him, but the medic hesitated. He stays with me, Ethan murmured. Thomas gave a single nod. He earned it. The officer stepped aside. Ranger climbed in without hesitation, curling beside Ethan like a loyal shadow. As the caravan of patrol vehicles began to wind down the trail, the rising sun painted the snow in shades of peach and gold. The air still carried the weight of gunpowder, but it also carried something else. Resolution. A sense that something had ended here, and something else was about to begin. Thomas stood beside the final vehicle, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon. The years of pain he had buried beneath silence and solitude now glimmered with the faintest light. Ethan, half asleep, felt the warmth of Ranger's fur and the hum of the engine beneath him. The pain would come later. The explanations, the headlines, the courtroom testimonies, all of it could wait. For now, there was only this: breath, silence, and the quiet truth of survival. Dawn settled softly over Bitterroot like a benediction, gilding the snow-dusted ridges with gold and painting long, quiet shadows down the worn trails of the forest. The chaos of the previous night had retreated with the stars, leaving behind the echoes of sirens, the ghost of gunpowder, and the silence of survival. Thomas sat on the back of a patrol vehicle, his arm loosely slung around Ethan's shoulder. The younger man, pale and bandaged, leaned into him with the weight of a body that had fought too long and a soul that had bled longer still. His breath was slow, shallow, but present. That was all that mattered. Paramedics bustled around them. One of them, a woman in her 50s named Sheila Gray-streaked ponytail, no-nonsense eyes, and a mother's gentleness hidden beneath her clinical efficiency, checked Ethan's vitals. He's stable, but he needs a hospital, she said, her voice low. He's lucky, but something tells me luck had 4 legs and a bark. Thomas looked down at Ranger, who sat beside Ethan's feet. The old German shepherd was coated in dried mud and ash, one ear bent, as always, chest rising and falling in rhythmic panting. A smear of blood, not his own, darkened the fur along his left flank. His eyes were alert but calm now, watching, always watching. The sheriff from Missoula County approached, a tall, weathered man with a sheriff's star dulled by years of politics and paperwork. His name was Dale Murphy, mid-60s, with deep crow's feet and a tired gaze that had seen too many crime scenes and not enough justice. He extended his hand to Thomas. "You and your boy saved lives today," he said, "and that dog, he's something else." Thomas shook his head. "I didn't do it for the medal, and I sure as hell didn't do it alone." Murphy nodded and turned toward Ranger. "We'd like to hold a ceremony, not for press, just the town. Folks need stories like this." He hesitated. "Would Ranger attend?" Thomas looked at the dog, then at Ethan. The younger man, half lucid, managed a faint smile. "Only if he gets a steak," Ethan whispered. 3 days later, the ceremony was held in front of the old community hall nestled at the edge of Bitterroot's town square. The building, once a schoolhouse, now stood as the heart of the town's memory. A place of potlucks, elections, and the occasional vigil. For once, it wasn't grief they were gathering for. Children sat on the stone steps, their cheeks pink from the cold, holding signs made of cardboard and marker scrawls that read, "Thank you, Ranger," and "Our Mountain Guardian." A banner hung above the door, hand-painted in gold and green letters. "Guardian of the Mountain." Ranger stood still in front of the crowd, tail held high, eyes scanning, ears twitching at every sound. Someone had brushed his coat and cleaned the dried blood, but the scars remained, one on the hind leg, the bent ear, and now a fresh graze along his right shoulder. The kids didn't mind. To them, he looked like a hero carved from the wild. Mayor Ellen Brooks, a petite woman with fierce gray eyes and a cane from a long-forgotten skiing accident, took the podium. She wore her Sunday coat and a knitted scarf with pine trees stitched into the wool. "We live in a town where winters are long, and sometimes hope is hard to find," she said, her voice trembling with the cold and emotion. "But hope walked on 4 legs this week. Hope barked. Hope saved." As she spoke, a bell began to toll softly from the chapel down the street. Its sound washed gently over the gathering, and many lowered their heads. Some wept. Some simply smiled. For the first time in years, Bitterroot was not mourning. It was honoring. Ethan, now steadier on his feet but with a crutch under one arm, stood beside Thomas at the edge of the crowd. He wore a clean flannel, patched jeans, and his father's old coat. The bruises on his face had faded into shades of green and yellow, and though his body was still weak, his spirit stood taller than ever before. He turned toward Thomas and said, his voice quieter than the snow falling around them, "You're more than a mentor. You're the father I never had. Or maybe the one I lost before I knew him." Thomas didn't reply right away. He looked down at his boots, then up at Ethan. His weather-beaten face, once always hardened like mountain stone, cracked into something softer. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "And you're the son I didn't know I needed." As they stood in silence, Ranger moved between them and pressed his head into their legs, nudging softly. His body relaxed, the mission complete. The bond that once was forged in fire and fear had become something else, something enduring. Later, as the ceremony came to a close, the children surrounded Ranger and gently placed a collar around his neck. It was handmade leather, with silver lettering etched by the town's blacksmith. "Guardian of the Mountain." Ranger sat proudly, ears lifted, eyes gleaming. The mountains behind him seemed to bow in the golden light, as though they too recognized the sentinel in their midst. Thomas, watching from a distance, felt something loosen in his chest. A knot long bound by regret and silence. He hadn't smiled in years, not truly, but now his lips curved upward. Just slightly, but it was enough. The snow began to fall again, soft and quiet, covering the footsteps of those who had come and gone. But the story of a man, a boy, and a dog would stay etched in the heart of Bitterroot like frost on glass. Unmoving, undeniable. Sometimes miracles don't come in flashes of lightning or grand voices from the heavens. Sometimes they walk on tired legs, with scarred fur and faithful eyes. Sometimes they arrive not to part seas, but to guard hearts. In this story, God didn't send thunder, He sent Ranger. He didn't shout through clouds, He whispered through loyalty, courage, and love. Thomas and Ethan weren't just rescued from danger, they were rescued from years of silence, guilt, and sorrow. And isn't that what grace truly is? A second chance. A new family. A scar that doesn't hurt anymore because it helped someone else heal. Let this remind us that in our daily lives we may be surrounded by quiet miracles. A kind word, a loyal friend, a stranger's help, and sometimes a dog who never gave up on you. If this story moved your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, healing, and loyalty. And in the comments, write Amen. If you believe that God still sends His angels, even the 4-legged kind. May the Lord bless you and protect all those who wait for their own miracle.